What the March and March organization and social media commentary has shown us is that South Africans tend to think that we are the golden children of Africa and that we are far better off than the rest of the continent. But when you actually start looking at things from the perspective of young people as the next generation, you start realizing we're all in the same boat. And if we as youth don't step up to the plate, then things are only going to get worse from here. But that's why I'm here to interview Freddy Mulli, a young Kenyan business owner who has founded a youth-focused entrepreneurship organization, been featured in countless podcasts, and conducted several TED Talks. We're here today to talk about what's going on, where we're going, and what this actually means for African youth across business and entrepreneurship. Let's find out. So, Freddie, in a time where AI is impacting education and Africans are starting to lose a sense of Pan-Africanist identity and youth-owned businesses are fearing that they are losing traction in the market, some are starting to believe that Africa is looking bleak in comparison to the West. But you actually took the initiative to found Youth Plus.
Yes.
What exactly was the turning point for you that convinced you to actually start?
Thanks for the question, Michaela. And so we began Youth Plus because we realized that we are just as vulnerable with the youth unemployment crisis that we were facing in Kenya. And this was sometimes back, that was 2016, almost a decade ago. And we were feeling the anxiety, but also the panic around following a process that we had been told by our parents to follow. And what we were finding was quite simply jobs weren't readily available for every person that was graduating from university at the time. And the case still remains till today. And so we started analyzing the situation in our environment, and we tapped into a hustler kind of spirit that we saw among our peers and among Kenyans and Africans at large. And what we wanted to work around or hypothesize was, if the existing market can't create enough jobs commensurate with the number of people who are graduating from university, then perhaps what we need to do is increase that pool of available industry and companies that are then offering these opportunities. And the solution at the point became entrepreneurship. But then looking into entrepreneurship and doing a deep dive into the factors around running a company, we discovered that a lot of them don't get to the 2-year, 3-year mark. And so we decided then perhaps that's where the problem needs to be addressed. How do we encourage young people to get into business the right way? Start with the foundation and with a solid ground to work with. And from that point onwards, we can then increase the survival rate of youth-led businesses and by effect, increasing the number of opportunities that are available for young people leaving university.
Yeah, because Youth Plus does a lot of mentorship programs, a lot of workshops, a lot of webinars. What did Youth Plus actually look like when it first started versus how does it look like now?
That's a great question. So obviously over a decade, there's a lot of growth that happens, and sometimes that growth is very painful. So we began with a team of 3 that then became a team of 4. A lot of the times our boardrooms were coffee shops. Our meetings were being held wherever we could find each other and wherever we could find space. And our first initial kind of workshop or conference that we organized had a total attendance of 49 young entrepreneurs, which obviously was well below the estimate that we had for ourselves. And over 10 years, through a lot of mistakes that we've made, a lot of mistakes that we've seen other businesses in our space make, we're now a team of 6. We've been able to engage directly just over 13,000 young people in business. We began sort of like a milestone, a hallmark event in our portfolio, which is the Youth Plus Festival, which grew from 1,400 in the first year to 2,300 in the second year. So I'd say that the growth is obviously very significant to see, particularly for myself, who's been there from the beginning. But I'd say we're a lot more organized, a lot more structured in our thinking, a lot more scientific in how we diagnose different challenges that we're seeing in the market that we'd like to address. So there's a lot less, let me say, haphazard and the naivety of youth. I'd say that's the biggest difference in how we're operating today.
Yeah, I mean, as a business owner myself, as you go on, you learn what works, you learn what doesn't. And because Youth Plus takes a Pan-Africanist approach, it touches on so many different facets of African entrepreneurship. When we look at Youth Plus, although it delivers its vision via a Pan-Africanist lens, you also share political perspectives on Kenyan governance as well across your social media. And when we look at South Africa specifically on this channel, we speak a lot about sociopolitics, what's impacting young people, entrepreneurship, and employment especially. When we look at South Africa right now, we are currently sitting with almost 46% youth unemployment. But when we cut to the Kenyan unemployment landscape, what does that actually look like on the ground for Kenyan youth right now?
I mean, it's a situation that's quite severe, I would say. And we've seen interventions from government point of view in terms of how they'd like to address this challenge. We've seen a number of programs starting up. We've had affirmative action funds being established. But I think there's still a lot more than can be done, but in particular with how the interventions are created from the word go. I think we prefer to look at it from a holistic point of view in terms of ourselves as a youth economic factor, the public sector being government, the private sector being the existing corporate environment, and also the development community, because you find a lot of non-governmental organizations, a lot of non-profits also have interventions in this space. What I feel like we've struggled the most with is how to connect the different interventions and the different research we're all conducting. And what happens is a lot of us seem to be working in silos, which is what we're trying to sort of remedy at the moment. And so you find perhaps one youth organization is doing Project X and another one is doing Project Y, which is quite similar. But then because of the disparity and the lack of communication across the ecosystem, a lot more needs to be done from a governance and accountability point of view. I think what we've seen our government effect to date is grant programs, which is currently running, and loan services that aren't quite as diligent, one, in establishing who is receiving these loans and whether they're actually ready for such financing. For them to understand once you receive capital in the form of debt financing, then will impact how you're able to run your company or run your business. And secondly, just as a repayment model and factor, we have what called a Youth Enterprise Development Fund, but there's a high number of those loans that default. When the current administration came into government, they introduced a Hustler Fund, and a similar challenge was met. And so right now, as they roll out the World Bank funded Nyota program, which is a grant-based program, the question still remains, are we simply putting money into a pot that's then disappearing without any trackable or measurable measures of growth? And I think that's where we need to a little bit more diligent and intentional around how we are rolling out some of these programs, and perhaps even look at it from a point of view of maybe a non-profit or grant model isn't the way to go. Maybe a social enterprise, which is profit-centered, but centered around social impact. Maybe that's a model that we need to look into more, because when you get into business, there's no handouts, there's nothing for free. And so perhaps the mindset needs to change, but then also the interconnectivity between the different players in the ecosystem needs to be a bit more firm and a lot more diligent than I think exists at the moment.
Look, when we actually view youth-owned businesses, we actually start seeing globally. Not only is qualifications becoming such a cornerstone of being able to enter the hiring process, but it's also experience. But if every business out there requires experience, how are you to gain that experience? And we have spoken about that on this channel. So people are motivated to just start a business. You actually did a TED Talk back in 2017. You spoke about how a focus needs to be shifted from meeting needs to inspiring creativity. And you go through the importance of African unity and being able to work together to achieve a variety of unifying visions while still being able to hold yourself accountable. In South Africa, when we do look at businesses that are currently starting by young people, it's become the issue of they are starting a business out of necessity because that is a way for them to gain that experience, to gain a source of income. And it's no longer a matter of starting a business to meet a specific consumer need. When we do look at businesses that keep the country going, businesses that everybody depends on in their day-to-day lives, we look at technology companies, food franchises, publishers of educational materials, or even social media platforms like YouTube and Instagram. It's mainly due to international investments and entities from the West, making us as South Africans and at a larger scale Africans dependent on these international businesses. So how do we actually get the next generation to actually start investing and executing in long-term business goals?
That's a great question, because I think we face a similar challenge in Kenya. And I think the way to go about it is, one, shifting the mindset from just wanting to have a small side hustle on the side, and perhaps going in with a focus of building a business as quickly and as rapidly as possible. Because if we've seen anything from the success of entrepreneurship landscapes in the West, particularly in the US, a lot of the ecosystem is designed around building startups within the smallest amount of time, but to the greatest scale that they can, to then exit or merge with a larger firm and then become that huge multinational that we see dominating in different markets across the globe today. But then also, I think utilizing as many of the technological resources around us that we can. Clearly, AI being one of those tools and resources that we can tap into, sort of catalyze that growth as quickly as possible. And so I think it's a combination of, one, going in with the mindset of we're giving ourselves a limited amount of time to scale this as rapidly as we can. But then secondly, tapping into existing technologies that creating revolutions of their own before it's too late for us.
You mentioned AI. Like you said, a lot of small youth-owned businesses often use AI to learn new skills within a specific industry, or even automate processes when there are limited resources available. And it has become a very valuable resource. But then you also have people on the back end as anti-AI activists, if you will, who talk about the impact that AI has on critical thinking skills development and how it impacts young people by encouraging a lack of media literacy skills and exercising those media literacy skills, especially when it comes to identifying misinformation in political media, or being able to fact check sources about industry specific insights. How much AI would you say is actually too much in the self-educational space specifically, especially when it comes to youth entrepreneurship?
I'd say, like any evolving technology or any evolving innovation, I think moderation, I think leveraging AI rather than fully depending on AI, because AI itself is still developing and still improving. I would advocate for doing both. AI is meant to be a lever, it's not meant to be a crutch. The function and the key role AI plays is in helping bridge that time gap, so you don't have to spend 3-4 years trying to understand the technology or trying to learn how to code. You can tap into AI for that. But I think it's for us to understand and take that responsibility ourselves, rather than to simply joyride on and expect success at the end of the rainbow, because it simply won't work that way.
So we go from using AI as a means of self-education amongst various different parts of entrepreneurship and managing a business. When we look at South Africa and we look at skills development in the formal education space, formal education is regulated by government departments such as the Department of Basic Education with regards to primary school and high school, and then also the Department of Higher Education and Training, which deals with colleges and universities. Both departments are now focusing on promoting African-centric education in the formal sector. And when we look at the Department of Basic Education, for example, they are now proposing a new history curriculum with a more Pan-Africanist lens to really understand a full history of the continent. And here on the channel and across other social media, I try to also implement a more Pan-Africanist view, because I believe that it really does recognize the rich histories and multicultural experiences of African cultures and the various African ethnicities. But recently, I'm not so sure if you heard, but we recently had a movement called March and March, and it had a nationwide movement back in June. And as a result of not only illegal immigration being targeted, but also legally documented foreigners, South Africans have now been labeled as xenophobic. And because of that label, we are seen as being less susceptible to embracing that Pan-Africanist perspective. So when you look at Youth Plus, which, works with various entrepreneurs from all across the continent, what would you note for the next generation of young African leaders and even South African leaders that are some similarities that you see across Africa?
Well, I think one is that need and that yearning for connection. More than ever, we're finding young Africans, perhaps even younger than my generation, who not only want to experience Africa from a leisure point of view, but then would want to engage in conversations with their African peers from different countries. I think that it in itself presents an opportunity for, one, just being open as possible to the identity of Africanism, and understanding that at the end of the day, we are all truly one tribe, one people as a continent. And I think that mindset then begins to open the floodgates into what's possible, whether that's from a leadership point of view, an entrepreneurship point of view, or even just socially, whether it's understanding different cultures, different people, different dialects, appreciating the history that makes each of us unique, but at the same time ties us together to this African promise. I think it also behooves us to make sure that we're truly well informed. I think with the amount of information that's put out now, and also the amount of various ways AI is misused and abused to put out untrue or false information, I think it behooves us to take that extra step and ownership over what we're receiving and the kind of information or media we're consuming, and understanding the different nuances around different challenges, such as the one that existed in South Africa with illegal immigration. I think it's very easy, and it's also very lazy, if I'm being honest, if we simply read a tweet about a headline and assume that that's the reality on the ground. I think if we're being true to ourselves as young people and as young Africans who wish the best for our various countries, our various cultures, but also for Africa as a whole, then I think we need to take ownership of elimination of ignorance, because it's very easy to read a tweet with a simple headline and have an emotional response.
And run with
But
it.
I think exactly, and I think we need to be different from generations that perhaps fell to the sideways of such trends. We need to be the generation that uses all of the information that we have access to. So I think we need to go a step deeper and a step further and actually use all of the tools around us and stop being misled as easily as perhaps is possible right now.
Speaking of similarities, when we look at Kenya and South Africa, history-wise, we actually share quite a common sentiment. You know, both were governed by one party alone, Kenya since 1982 and South Africa between 1948 and both into the early 90s. And both also experienced suppression of human rights, where Kenya actually established its Bill of Rights in its 2010 constitution. And I was looking at your Instagram, a beautiful Instagram, very, very, very nice. And I came across a quote that you posted, and I think it is so beautiful. It reads, "Old enough to remember the dark days, but young enough to make sure history doesn't repeat itself." And I think that is beautiful. So in closing, if you could have warned a young Kenya, which is now South Africa, when we look at our growing unemployment rates, the actions of government and corruption practices of the private sector, what would you share as an early warning to young leaders, whether it's young Kenyan leaders, young South African leaders, young African leaders?
I think the answer is in the question. I think it's focus on leadership, and don't dwell too much on politics and politicians. I think I've often said, I think what's truly hurting Kenya at the moment is we have an overpopulation of politicians and deficit of leadership and leaders. I think a leader looks to connect, a politician looks to control. And I think that's what we're suffering from at the moment. We have too many individuals who can't see beyond tomorrow, next week, and can't see beyond the radius of their home, because leaders won't give you handouts. Leaders will institute policies that have sustainable growth for everyone and not just for a handful of people. Leaders won't have flashy, rosy statements about promises that they'll never even achieve or even try to achieve. Politicians have those in abundance. I think, if anything, I always wonder what's in the notes app of many politicians. And I think it's exactly what we hear in different rallies or different media across mainstream and digital media. I think let's understand what leadership means for ourselves, because it's aspirational. And I think we need more leaders, and we need to begin with understanding what leadership is, what the expectation of leadership should be. And then I think we begin to correct a lot of the mistakes that those in power today truly have made and have set us back. That would be my unsolicited advice to a younger Kenya, a younger Africa.
I have for the longest time seen a lot of similarities between various regions throughout Africa. And I think a big facet that a lot of people look past is that we are ultimately going through a lot of things that are very similar. And when we look at those similarities, that is where you find unity, where you find that similar identity. When we look at Youth Plus and your emphasis on leadership, your emphasis on young entrepreneurs, finding that connection across Africa, that I think is so beautiful.
Thank you. And I think it's still very attainable. It's definitely a lot of work to do, and it's a lot of reaching out and forming these relationships and on establishing these common goals with our peers across the continent. But I definitely think it's very attainable, because I think from leadership, then we move into justice, and that's social justice, economic justice, and there's just dignity as a concept of basic human rights, and not as a privilege that is handed out by people who appoint themselves to some of these positions. But I think it is possible, and I know we will get there one day.
I just feel like it's really inspiring to see young people taking that leap at such a large scale also. So yeah, it was really insightful speaking to you, and I'm really, really glad. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
I think when hopefully we'll get to South Africa in the next year, and I'll be sure to give you a shout and invite you to what we're holding, God willing.
And there you have it, Freddy Mulli. You know, one thing that really stood out for me throughout the course of this discussion was that South Africans tend to think that we are far better off than the rest of the continent, but we are all just moving in the same direction. And as the next generation, us as young people, we need to make changes in business, make changes in entrepreneurship, make changes in politics, and be, as Freddy says, leaders in order to move Africa and even South Africa forward. But for now, I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.